Good to see everyone today. Excited about this podcast.
I could see you too. You and Eugene have the same headphones?
Well, he suggested what we use.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I'm just a wonderful man.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say, they look like the same ones. I was,
Yeah, just a cheap little $20
But,
pair of gaming
we're
headphones.
like brothers, so,
So Don's going to be joining us in a minute. He's doing some work, and he will join us. How's everybody feeling? Like, what any topics coming to mind today for y'all around things you feel like talking about before Don joins us? I figured that the topic of today's, because where we left off last week was, Peter, you're going to talk about your experience of ableism, right?
Yeah, at least for a little bit. If folks don't mind, because Don and I were starting to, and I would look around that.
So I figured go ahead.
I just want to make sure that other folks can talk about what they need to talk about too.
Mm-hmm. In the spirit of that, I was suggesting that we make the topic of this episode ableism, what it is. Like there's certainly more to talk about that than more than one podcast. So, we can kind of all come together and talk about this. So Peter, did you want to wait till Don gets on so you can talk to him directly, or did you want to maybe start the conversation in general?
Well, we can start it in general if you want to, basically just get a bit of it last week. Getting rid of all types of discrimination is important, but often one that people don't remember or think about is ableism. And ableism is basically, in a nutshell, thinking that people with disabilities are less than or not making accommodations, like, for example, holding a meeting in a space that's inaccessible, or not creating space to make sure that folks with disabilities have what they need to equally participate. And this also happens a lot in employment. Oftentimes employers want to pay us less than people without disabilities. It started off kind of back in the 40s and 50s when the federal government established a sub-minimum wage law that allowed people with disabilities back in the 40s and 50s to make less than the minimum wage. And fortunately, even the laws on the book, most places aren't like that anymore, but particularly people who work in kind of segregated environments often are subject to the sub-minimum wage laws, and they're treated really badly. It happens a lot in every part of life when you sort of make an assumption about somebody because of their disability where they're not given a voice or treated equitably. Like, I always have to remind folks when I go places that you got to make sure you have an accessible restroom. Well, that's important. And sometimes folks don't really take that seriously. And I get there and there's no restroom. So I have to immediately leave. Or when employers don't design their businesses to be accessible, that's a form of discrimination too. In other words, not that we're asking folks to change the world, but at least try to take better steps to include us.
Yeah, access. That's really a huge pivotal point, right?
Right.
I heard you, Peter. I heard you say something about you said equitability or equitably in your what you were saying, right? Talking
Right.
about. So I just wanted you to, for anyone listening that might not know what the difference between equality and equity is. So if you want to explain that, I don't want to put you on the spot. If not,
Well, I'll try to explain it the best way I can, and other folks, I want you to feel good to weigh in.
Yeah, sure.
I think when equal isn't always equitable. In other words, if you provide, if you provide a voting space where people can go to vote and it's accessible, that might be equal. But if you don't provide accessible transportation to get there, that's not equitable. Because I have no way to get to where I need to go vote, okay? So you can have, in your argument, well, you don't provide transportation, so the bus route shouldn't go there. But people with disabilities often don't drive because of their disabilities. Many people do. I don't. So if I don't have someone to drive me, or I don't have a bus, if it's not on an accessible bus line, I can't go vote. So you have to have a way for folks to get there. And that's what I would consider equitable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's I think that was a good succinct explanation. You take the buses. Do you find do you need any mobility support? Like I sometimes see buses that kneel and also have a lift on it, but some buses I don't see that on. Like even school buses, for instance, they don't seem accessible for individuals who might have mobility issues.
Well, it depends. School buses are required to be accessible, but not every bus. But if a student needs a bus to be accessible, then the district has to have one that can transport them to school. And for the most part, they're supposed to be able to ride with students without disabilities. So they might only have a few buses that are accessible. I mean, it would be nice if they all were, but that doesn't happen. Now, for the public bus, it has to be accessible. Because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So by now, the majority of the buses should be accessible. It's, as far as equitably, in order for us to get where we need to go, since it's statistically, people who are older adults and people with disabilities are the most transit dependent, not to mention folks that, are low and moderate income and other, usually marginalized communities who cannot afford vehicles or,
There was another topic that you kind of brushed on that I think is an important one. Even if we do have an accessible neighborhood, there is also the inclusivity issue. I work at an organization that serves people with developmental disabilities, mostly like autism, cerebral palsy, microcephaly, Down syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing is I think we do a pretty good job at bringing them into the community, but still the community doesn't always seem to incorporate us into like the main space. So do you have anything to say about that from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, that often happens. I mean, just thinking about city programs and recreation, we spend a lot of time really advocating for like accessible playgrounds for kids. with disabilities. Meaning the material to move around the playground, not be sand, because sand isn't accessible for us. So to use material that's not necessarily grass. Grass is really never accessible. So they look at different types of rubber mat surfaces and other materials that are more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, there's a lot of technology that you can make a pathway blend into the original natural pathway. You'll see this in parks. They'll use different material to make trails accessible, but it still looks like the original trail that kind of helps work with the folks and get irritated if you change anything and it doesn't look natural. But it is still hard to, while cities and, while there's more opportunities for folks in the community, sometimes it's really hard to participate. Like, for example, Eugene and I are good friends. So we worked to make sure I had all the equipment I needed, so I sounded really good on the podcast. And one of the things I worked out with him, I have to drink liquid periodically when I talk all the time, so there's space to allow me to do that. Because that makes this more comfortable for me. Whereas, sometimes when you're in community, sometimes I go to meetings where they only give like a 5-minute break to go to the bathroom. I have to say, that doesn't work for me. I need at least 10. And they go, why? You don't want to know, but trust me, I need 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, how we approach time and access is a whole other conversation within the conversation of ableism. When you just think about how time, the expectations around time, around what most people take for granted, and the expectations that people can just project. I mean, look at how grumpy people are when they're not getting their coffee fast enough, right? Like when they're all of a sudden faced with just a completely different lived experience that they can't relate to, and they're just trying to get their coffee or whatever, that can cause conflict in some ways, right? And so, I mean, that's another aspect of ableism that is not, I think this is kind of in line with what Don was talking about last week, which is the self-work part. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, how many people, Peter, can you just like roll into their house for lunch to just like hang out with them? Like, how many houses?
Houses, not that many unless I work out getting a portable ramp. Now, I actually do have a couple portable ramps where I live, and oftentimes if I have to go to someone's house, I sort of talk to them about how many stairs they have, and if it's not too many, I can use a portable ramp and I can bring that. Apartments, if they're, relatively new, I can get to fairly well, and certainly with new construction around apartments, they come under the Fair Housing Act federally, so they have to at least be accessible as far as their front entrances. And, well, I should explain that there's a difference between accessible and adaptable. All new construction relative to apartments has to be at least adaptable. So if I want to live there, they can put in things like grab bars and other things that I may need to make it accessible, and some lower counters. Accessible is when you put in all the features right out the gate. But front entrances and all that are supposed to be accessible. Areas of common use. So nowadays things are a little better than they were back in the day. But really, ableism is sort of when you aren't given an opportunity that you otherwise qualified for or can do because of a disability, or a feeling that, Or like, for example, you sit on a board and you're the only voice of the person with a disability, and you have people without disabilities trying to make decisions or discounting your experience. Or when they tell you, well, you can't make a decision on whether something should be accessible because you're personally affected, so you can't make that decision. What, I can't look at the law and decide what the requirements are, have a voice in that.
The boards, they exclude you because they think it's a conflict of interest. Is that what you are getting at?
Well, it doesn't happen so much now, but back in the day, a few years ago, I guess it wasn't that long ago, I applied to be on a board on another city where I live, and they actually said, and it was an access board. It was evaluating accessibility. So what would happen was somebody would, the building department would tell them that something needed to be accessible, and they wanted to appeal it. And so they would come in front of this board, and I applied to be on it. And they originally said, or one of the people said, well, because you're disabled, you have a conflict because it affects you directly. And I'm like, well, but remember, you're supposed to have somebody on this board that can give you the disability perspective.
You have a hold on, let me break this down. We can't we can't take you into consideration around how we're going to go about organizing space because you as a disabled person have your own interests in mind around how you should be able to navigate that. I mean, if that isn't ableism, I don't know what is. It's like...
I mean, as if the people that are able, that without the disabilities don't have their own interests in mind when they're making decisions. Like,
I mean, that's just so weird. That's like...
Yeah, that's pretty absurd.
It's like inviting someone over to lunch and then having stares and being like... well, you can't get up these stairs? Well, you're just biased, like...
Yeah.
That's absurd. Let's hear from Suzanne. She has a comment.
Well, I just wanted to raise my hand before I just jump in and start talking over people. But I came across one of those barriers, and what I was trying to do with the project is making a particular gallery space more accessible to people. And I just hit this roadblock because I felt that I stopped it. Like, I just completely stopped it because no one was listening, to what people were saying, what they needed and stuff like that. And it's sitting there. It's just sitting there and it's not accessible, and it's frustrating. And I'm glad that we're talking about this because this is really important, especially when we're doing anything that we're building or renovating or something like that. So
yeah, and along with the physical access issues around disability or programmatic access, there's the attitudinal aspects of ableism. Someone says something based on how they feel, and the person says no. They sort of discount them because of their disability, or automatically assume that someone's not capable of doing something that they can do. Maybe they need an accommodation. Okay. For example, I'm a pretty brilliant writer, but oftentimes if I can do voice activated software on my computer, but if it's a long document, I usually hire someone who can actually type, so then I dictate what I want, because frankly, while voice-activated software is pretty good, it's really tiring too because of my respiratory issues. And sometimes when I tell folks, well, I need to have a typist, they go, oh, you just can't, They make an assumption like, I'm not putting together the document myself. I actually am. I just need an accommodation to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens a lot in one area too. Sometimes you're working on a project for work and they hire a consultant or somebody without a disability and they pay them more than they're paying you for something that you can do just as well as the person that they hired without the disability. But they don't give you the option to prove that. Or they say, well, you haven't done that before. Well, maybe it's because you didn't give me the opportunity. Not that I can't do it. There is a problem with disability agencies, and I work for disability agencies and non-disability agencies. I do find employers that don't employ or employers that don't have a disability focus are often better to people with disabilities and some of the disability service agencies. And I had an issue, or there was an issue where this company was hiring non-disabled or people without severe disabilities as consultants and paying them more. And that happens kind of a lot. I really don't like that at all.
Hmm.
And if I sound disgruntled, I'm really not. It just hits a nerve.
No, it's okay. It's good to show some, emotion along with this because your feelings matter.
Mm-hmm.
The frustrations that you have with the things that are happening around you, those are important. And, this, I know you said you don't expect everyone to change the world, but
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to, for sure. So.
Yeah. Well, that's you always get that reaction, when you say, all right, we should make things accessible, and they say, well, we as a society shouldn't have to accommodate for you. You should accommodate for us. And it's like, well, when we created society, did we have a democratic say in who is the standard for accommodation? No, we didn't. We had able-bodied people that got to make all the decisions, and, well, no surprise, it's not accommodating for every person, not even remotely. Like, even people that are left-handed have a lot of issues in our society because there's not many like right-handed right or not very many left-handed accommodations. So that's something. It's just, when people say that we're the best, we designed society for everyone. No, they designed it for a very small subset of people who did not have the. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they kind of assumed that they were everyone, that they were the average.
Right. Go ahead, Eugene.
I mean, I don't know if it's so much of an assumption. I think it's a lack of desire to care. It's part of like disposable society, right? Anything that doesn't appeal to the ideal to which all is designed around is disposable. And then the justification for that emerges in whoever's mind is making the decision to do that, So I'm sure there's people that maybe assume that everybody can just, work like they do. I'm sure I would wager that's real, but you know, this is where I get a lot of flack when I try to point out like ableist language and like the hinge of ableist language inherently being to like demean and push down. And and every time I talk about it, I seem to get approached like I'm talking about it from some like moral standpoint, like, oh, good people should act this way. And I'm just like, I don't think it's about good or bad. If you know, that's the one ableist language is where I see the energy of demeaning the other, like all across the political spectrum, all across it. Like, it doesn't matter who's arguing with who, they're all using ableist language to do it. Right. And then ableist language is used to demean and empower the one who's doing the demeaning, like so quick and easy. It's like a you know, it's like a hit in the head. You get that dopamine hit of like, oh, I'm the superior one because that person's a this or a that. You know what I mean? And like, you know, and I'm not trying to put too much on that because one of the things I get pushback on this is like, oh, it's just words, it's just language. And I'm talking about this from a diversity of tactics you know, perspective, where like, if we're trying to change the world and we have to have diversity of tactics, then we should be hitting it on every front that we can. And removing language that's like, you know, inherently designed to demean each other doesn't seem like a terrible idea. And if that also affects our approach on how we see each other, how we organize, that doesn't seem like a terrible idea either. So I don't know. I just want to put that out there.
Well, yeah, I don't, okay, yeah, I was just gonna, let me just get this large, yeah, I wanted to show an image of, since we were talking about inclusivity and accessibility, I just wanted to show this chart. I know that people who are just listening on audio, they're not going to be able to see this, but could I share the screen?
Yeah. Let me go for it. You should be able to right now.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, let's get out of that. Yeah, so here's a good diagram I've seen going around, like, you know, how you know, sometimes there's integration, but really what it is they're building a community within the larger community, but they're still not included in the whole thing. You know, I mean, it's a step better than segregation, as you can see, but like inclusion requires accessibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is just I really like this chart. It's a good, really great. You know.
Do you want to? Can we give a verbal description of all of it so that people experiencing this podcast and can't see can really break it down?
Yeah, so in the diagram you have 4 bubbles to demonstrate different types of accessibility. You have exclusion, which is the predominant group is within the circle and all the marginalized people are not within their own community, but they're just kind of on the sideline of everything. Segregation is where you have 2 groups, but they're not mixed in. There's no overlap between their 2 societies. Integration is when there's like the majority in group is built around the minority, the marginalized group. However, there is a boundary between the 2, so they are not mixed in with each other. Now, inclusion is where the minority is completely accessible, or it's completely accessible for minorities and marginalized people to become integrated in the society. I guess I should say included, not integrated. Like, from a network standpoint, all the people who are part of the majority are communicating with each other and not with the people in the integrated community that's within.
So just another visual cue. The majority is represented as little green circles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Green circles peppered inside of a sphere or a circle. The circle being the boundaries of, I guess, society, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all the green circles inside the big circle that is the boundaries are the majority. The quote unquote out group is all the different colored circles who are about, I don't know, like a quarter. There's like a blue, some blue circles, some yellow circles, some red ones. And there's, in total, those different colored circles make up another little circle. And the integration model has a small circle inside a larger circle. The smaller circle contains all the multicolored circles with a boundary around them, surrounded by the green dots, the green circles inside the larger circle. Segregation is the small circle with the multicolored circles outside of the main circle. Mm-hmm. Exclusion is all the different colored circles in a circle outside around the circle of the boundary of the circle with the green circles inside. And then there's at the top inclusion, which is one big circle and all the multicolored circles are interdispersed equally throughout the green circles. Mm-hmm. Did I do that right?
Yeah. I think that was, some of the audience might hear it and just keep hearing circle, 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 circle. So they might be a little confused, but they're free to check out the video in case they do get confused. But I think you did a good job explaining that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing.
Yep. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Cool. So one of the things I appreciate about what conversations are happening around this is the conversation of universal design. And I know, Peter, that's something you've talked about and heard about. Have either of you heard about that before?
Say that again.
Universal design. I see you shaking your head, Suzanne.
Universal design.
Yes, I've heard a lot about it, and I began looking into it, and so that's where I'm at now, is just getting better understanding of it, so that way can figure out ways to implement it better. Because right now it seems like it's happening. It's just not happening fast enough, if that makes sense. Like,
how would you define it?
Well, it's like where the environment is completely accessible by everyone. Mm-hmm. Is that a good definition?
Yeah, I do have a description I could read if you're interested.
Go for it.
Okay, it says universal design is the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, mm-hmm. regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. This is on the National Disability Authority website, mm-hmm. universaldesign.ie. Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty damn high bar. I love it. It's like the highest bar.
Yeah. It is, but it's something to dream and to always be incorporating when you're designing, like 100%. Equitable use, it needs to be flexible so it can adapt. Simple, because you need it to be, well, just like Tyler said, universal. So the information needs to be easily acceptable or perceptible. So it's just tolerance. I think there's a tolerance for error was one of the principles. Not as much like, too much physical effort. And then you want to think about size and space. So.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, I don't have epilepsy. My older sister did, but for her it wasn't as much about the bright flashing lights. But I did want to kind of get into that and like, for instance, high-tech cities, especially New York City, Tokyo, London, all the big cities, for a lot of people, going to see the ball drop in person is a very important thing for them. I personally heard it wasn't, there's no public restrooms and you're in a big crowd of people in the middle of the cold, and it doesn't sound like the most fun to me. But for people who value that, there's a lot of flashing lights in, say, Times Square where they have the major ball drop. I mean, I know they do it in other cities too, but yeah. So I was just thinking of people who may have sensitivity to light brightness. I know that for me, part of being on the autistic spectrum is I get information overload, so if I have a lot of lights flashing or a lot of sounds going on all at once, it gets to be very overwhelming to the point where I can't hear my own thoughts, and and then it just becomes a lot of noise and it gets to be pretty overwhelming. And this is another thing that I think some cities don't really take into account is, how their lights and crowding affects their accessibility to people with certain disabilities. Personally, I don't have as much of an issue. Like for me, it's a very mild one, but I know, for instance, the person I work with who has autism, he doesn't like to go to the fair because there's too much noise and lights and smells, and he said it's very overwhelming to him. But not because he doesn't want to go, but because he just is overwhelmed and feels like he can't go.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and you're right. That could be a significant barrier. I have friends that have epilepsy and seizure-related disorders, and we have to talk about where we go. This, of course, is pre-COVID, but we have to, I have to be a little bit of an advanced team person, and if we're going somewhere that might have lights, I have to actually go there beforehand just to make sure that it's still accessible for them, or whether it will or will not be. Same thing for folks that have, I don't know if you heard about environmental chemical sensitivities, or MCS, people that may be allergic to certain types of chemicals. There's a segment of the disability community, and this condition's been adopted as one of the conditions where they're covered by Social Security. So I have friends that have a hard time with different types of chemicals that are used in buildings. So when I was around this person a lot, if we were going to go to a meeting, I would have to do a little advance work to make sure that the area that she and I were going to be in didn't have any major chemical issues that would make her uncomfortable. And it wasn't just uncomfortable. First time I met her, we were actually at a demonstration, and we were at a anti-apartheid demonstration, and somebody came up to her and us, and they were smoking. Well, she immediately had a respiratory emergency because smoke really affects her.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked the person not to smoke right there, and they wouldn't stop. And this was like 30 years ago. And I just sort of reached up and took the cigarette right out of the person's mouth and got rid of it because it was causing a respiratory emergency. And he was...
Good for you. Good for you.
And, I can be a little, well, what's the term? I can be rather direct accent when I need to be. So we became the best friends after that. And we used to, she lives in another state now, but she and I used to go to a lot of demonstrations together. And that was my job, to make sure that she and other folks, would be okay if we were in some sort of an environment. One time, we got arrested in D.C. They were cutting federal funds for home care, which is something I use a lot. And originally, I wasn't planning on getting arrested. I was going to support because I was going to need to go back home. Well, she decided she wanted to at the last minute. So I couldn't really leave her. So we both got arrested. I used to do that from time to time years ago back in the day.
You do that for, your friends when there's an injustice, you get arrested for them. That's that to me is just, that's great. I've been there.
It's like I couldn't really, the cause was just, and I couldn't really leave her alone. Somebody had to be with her, at least from the beginning of the process, to help explain things, because sometimes if whatever she was breathing or chemical was really affecting her disability, they're not able to talk or communicate. So that was important. So yeah.
Did you find the police or find the jails to be accessible?
Well, I've actually been arrested a few times in my life. Truth be told, or truth to power, used to get arrested a lot. A lot of demonstrations for anti-war demonstrations and also anti-apartheid. And then there were a lot of demonstrations regarding disability services and transportation, making buses accessible. And no, the jails aren't really accessible. They are more so now, which I have good and bad feelings about.
Yeah.
In a way, people who are in custody have rights to their access rights, but on the flip side, it just means that they're more apt to arrest us sometimes nowadays. I think all my experiences in custody were relatively good. I mean, as good as you can be sometimes, since I was recognized as one of the leaders back in the day. Sometimes they would make me wait to be the very last person to use the bathroom or have any sort of assistance because they identified me as a leader. Although one time back in the late 80s, I was in a demonstration, a bunch of us were, and they cut the state of California, if they don't sign the budget back in the days, stops all payments other than emergency payments too, for funding for programs. And one of the programs that would stop was in-home supported services, which is the program that pays for a lot of home care for people with disabilities. Well, they also paid for my attendance. So a bunch of us went to the governor's office to protest to bring this to their attention. Well, unfortunately, the governor at the time really didn't listen, so we did a sit-in at the governor's office. And so we would do a sit-in. They would take us up to the holding area. And the first couple of days, they tried to take us to the hospital, but the hospital didn't want us. So we wound up in locked up at the San Francisco Hall of Justice on Bryant Street. And so what they did was they had separated all of us out, and they put me in a gymnasium, and they had a couple of the people in custody who were trustees take care of me. And actually, that was kind of a neat experience because we all bonded, and I stayed friends with them. I lost contact with one. I'm still in contact with the other one. I'm not sure what happened. They might have moved. I don't have them. I'm not in contact with them, but we stayed in contact pretty regularly for years. And so that was a good experience. And it was funny. They had me segregated off in the gymnasium so that no harm would come to me. They were afraid about what the other prisoners may or may not do. But I had to go through the main jail to leave when I was being released. And so when I was rolling, hang on. Mm-hmm. When I was rolling out through the main section of the jail, all the prisoners clapped because they'd all seen me on the news. I guess there was a lot of coverage, and so it was on all their TV, and they mentioned that I and probably 15 other folks were in custody. So that was empowering. Mm-hmm. These days, because of my employment and other things that I do, I can't really get arrested. Mm-hmm. And the other issue that's also concerning is that things have changed. That process might be a little more rougher now than it was back then. Mm-hmm. Back then, back then we were dealt with pretty nicely by the state police, for example. They knew why we were there. They did what they had to do, and we did what we had to do, but it wasn't really a rough interaction. They were actually, in a lot of cases, quietly supportive. But things have sort of changed now in the whole homeland security, and makes me a little bit cautious now. Mm-hmm. I know it probably shouldn't be that way, but it does, because mm-hmm. I'm also, when I did that, I was in my 20s and 30s, and now I'm in my 50s. So, yeah. And now if I get hurt, it's a problem. And I have family and people, and
mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So you're even saying your right to protest, your constitutional right is not even accessible anymore.
I mean, I still protest. I mean, I haven't really done it since COVID came in, but I was in a protest with somebody I care about. It was right before COVID really hit, and we went to a protest, and Black Lives Matter around George Floyd and other issues that were occurring. So I don't mind going into the streets, and still will. the part that I'm hesitant about is actually getting taken. The experience of the getting arrested piece.
Mm-hmm. But it's a common occurrence for police to come in and instigate violence. I mean, at least we saw a lot of that last summer and during the George Floyd protests. Not in Syracuse, I didn't experience any of that, but I noticed that it was a common occurrence in a lot of cities. So I mean, I can see why that would make it less accessible for for people who already might have some troubles with respiratory issues or mobility issues or whatever, like especially with all the tear gas that was going off. How would would that really hurt you, especially getting tear gassed? Like, do you think that would be more than anyone else without?
Well, I think tear gas isn't fun no matter what. I remember years ago, I wasn't directly, there were tear gas being used around me, and having it even done nearby was pretty bad for me. I have restrictive lung disease and some other health issues where I have to be really careful with my lungs because my lungs don't function right. I have major breathing issues, and most of the time I keep under control. But I went through a time a few months ago where I was really having a lot of respiratory distress, and turns out I had a little bit of pneumonia, and they didn't know because I was doing a video appointments, and so they thought it was related more to my chronic condition. Turned out to be pneumonia, but it had to get pretty bad before I was able to actually get in. But so I do have to be careful. So I mean, it doesn't mean that I won't in the future. It just means that I have to really think about it and make sure that there's a support system around that. If I was probably to get arrested, I'd probably choose a group of people who were willing to get arrested too. And I would have them take the role that I did for my friend. Okay, if I get arrested, I need this, and this. Here's a letter from my doctor. Because before I would get arrested, I would get a letter from my doctor that says what I need as far as around the breathing and all that support, from like having access to an inhaler and a nebulizer and the whole bit. And I would say, here, hand this to the police. And then I'd have to really, it wouldn't be an instantaneous decision. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's something I haven't really thought about too much. They never really, I don't think it's, they never really portray people with disabilities and how they interact with the police. So that's something I actually have never really thought about.
Well, if you want to learn more, there's a group called ADAPT. They're now American Disabled for Attended Programs today. They used to be, back when I was more involved, American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. But in brief, they're sort of the direct action wing of the disability rights movement. And they got arrested up at the U.S. Capitol for a lot of issues around healthcare and the ACA. And their primary focus is helping people with disabilities get out of institution And so they do a lot of direct action work around that. Back when I was really involved, and we were working on getting a national policy for accessible transportation, which all the transit companies, for the most part, including the national trade organization, were against. So we were following them from meeting to meeting and blocking inaccessible buses and, raising awareness sometimes at the front door of their hotel. But there's a whole bunch of, if you Google Adapt, you can see a whole bunch of great videos.
Yeah, I like their I like their logo a lot. It's the standard wheelchair with a stick figure man, but in it he's breaking his chains, and the motto says "Free our people, adapt." That's a really good logo. That's I've never heard of this before. Thank you for sharing that.
And I think I still have probably somewhere. I have a couple of Adapt T-shirts. I think they're either here or I hope I didn't lose them. But I remember there's one that's the American flag and the wheelchair, this kind of stick figure. And then there's chains, and then it says on it, the wheels of justice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's a good one.
And they do a lot of great direct action work. Like I said, they're sort of we used to say in the military wing of the disability rights movement, because it was sort of really paramilitary. I mean, because you really had to follow, their actions were done very, they were planned out, and they were like, it's like an hour. This is what you do. This is how you do it, and go. But now it's more, we say direct action, and now they kind of broke down the leadership structure a little bit so that more people could have a voice. And because even in disability groups, sometimes we have to remind ourselves that we have to be more equitable and more inclusive. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was a controversy because one of the members made a comment that was really inappropriate while he was doing a sit-in. And that really put them under the microscope for really not being as inclusive and as aware as they should have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Word. Well, I think we covered a lot of good ground. Does anybody have any inspirations or intuitions on the direction they feel like taking things?
I think I just need this to sink in a little to like fully grasp.
Word. Well, I think we could call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was a really good discussion. I think. Yeah. I think there's a lot more to talk about in future, but I think that's way too much to go on today.
Yeah.
They were super helpful talking about the way we should be designing things. I know that's a little bit selfish of me to go there, but I think it's really important. Really, really important because I want to incorporate that in everything that I do in the future. So,
well, your school, you were part of the design and architecture school, right? At your college or university, Susanna?
Well, it's just art and design, but we did have some architecture incorporated in it. So like
maybe at one point, maybe we should bring someone in from there and get their perspective from the design. So we can have person. So we can have a dialogue between people saying, look, maybe we need more people with disabilities to be the architects, to design these spaces. So it's not just a homogeneous architecture.
Right. I think that's wonderful. And I think that they're, to an extent, they need to hear this. Because they want us to learn to do it. They want us to be able to be empathetic and put ourselves in people's shoes. But I think like I've told them before, you need to make space and listen to the actual people and not put people I have disabilities too, but not, disabilities are diverse. So to have people who require more access than I do would be, is just better. It's just better.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we have some material for next time, or maybe later on, depending on who we can bring on those. I think it would be great to have some architecture professors or even architects themselves that are doing the designing and bring them in on this discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Word. Thank you all very much.
Once
again,
this was great.
Talking.
Appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Y'all be well.
You too.
Have a nice day.